The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red as Jake's motorcycle roared along the winding dirt roads of northern Mexico. The warm wind kicked up clouds of dust, and the dry, arid landscape stretched endlessly before him. He had been riding for hours, but his excitement remained undiminished. This was the adventure he had been craving. Just him, the open road, and the promise of something unknown. His destination was Pinos Altos, a remote village tucked away in the vast wilderness of Chihuahua. He had never been there before, but he had connected with Carlos, a local, through a travel forum. They had bonded over their shared love of exploration, and Carlos had extended an invitation for Jake to stay with his family. The idea of immersing himself in the simple life of a small Mexican village had been too tempting to pass up. As Jake neared the village, a creeping sense of isolation settled over him. The village was more remote than he had imagined. A few scattered houses dotted the dry terrain, and a dense forest loomed in the distance, its towering trees casting long, eerie shadows as twilight approached. Soon, he spotted Carlos's home, a modest adobe house with a sloping tin roof and a weathered wooden porch. Carlos was waiting outside, a broad grin on his face, waving as Jake pulled up and cut the engine. "Amigo, you made it," Carlos exclaimed, walking over to meet him. "Long ride, huh?" Jake dismounted, stretching his stiff back. "You have no idea," he chuckled, "but worth it." Carlos led him inside, where Jake met the rest of the family. Carlos's father, mother, 2 younger siblings, and his elderly grandmother. They welcomed him warmly, offering food and drink, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Though they smiled, there was a tension in the air, an unease that lingered beneath the surface. The smiles seemed thin, forced. As they sat down for dinner, Jake noticed how quiet the younger children were. The youngest boy, about 7, clung to his sister's hand, unusually silent. The grandmother muttered prayers under her breath in Spanish, crossing herself repeatedly before retreating into the shadows at the back of the house. The mood was far from what Jake had expected for a casual family gathering. He leaned closer to Carlos and lowered his voice. "Is something going on?" Carlos hesitated, exchanging a glance with his father before speaking. "My grandfather, he went into the forest a few days ago to search for our dog, but he hasn't come back. It's been 3 days." A chill ran down Jake's spine. "And no one's seen him since?" Carlos shook his head. "No, a few neighbors went looking for him, but they found nothing. And there's something else." His gaze drifted toward the window, where the darkening forest cast long shadows over the village. "Some people around here believe there's something in the woods. A creature." Jake raised an eyebrow. "A creature?" Carlos's father cleared his throat from the head of the table, his voice low and serious. "You'll hear the story soon enough. They say it hunts at night, drains the blood from livestock and leaves the bodies twisted and dry. People believe it's a curse." Jake tried to brush it off with a laugh, but the heavy atmosphere made it difficult. This wasn't just some local ghost story meant to spook an outsider. The fear in their eyes was too real. As the sun fully set, the air around the house grew colder. The family retreated quickly to their rooms after dinner, the mood somber and quiet. Even Carlos seemed distracted, his eyes flicking toward the windows as the sky darkened. Standing on the porch, Jake stared out at the thick forest, his mind unsettled. He had come in search of adventure, but now, something darker, more unnerving, was building inside him. The wilderness around him felt alive, pulsing with an energy he couldn't quite grasp. As the wind whispered through the trees and the first stars blinked into view, Jake began to wonder if he had made a mistake coming here. Night had settled heavily over the small village, and the unnatural silence that followed seemed to smother everything around it. The forest, which had once hummed with the sound of crickets and nocturnal animals, now lay disturbingly quiet. Jake sat on the edge of the small guest bed, staring out the window into the pitch-black night. The unsettling stories from dinner echoed in his mind. Something in the woods. A creature. A curse. Suddenly, there were footsteps outside his room, followed by a soft knock on the door. "Jake, come," Carlos's voice whispered from the doorway. "Something's happening." Jake followed Carlos to the front of the house, where the rest of the family had gathered around a single flickering lamp. Their faces were tense, their eyes fixed on the windows. Outside, in the distance, something moved. Is it? Jake asked, his chest tightening. It's my grandfather, Carlos's father said, his voice thick with disbelief. He's back. Jake squinted through the window, trying to make out the figure stumbling toward the house. The old man's clothes were torn, and his face was smeared with dirt and blood. His steps were slow and labored, as though each movement was a struggle. Abuelo! Carlos's father rushed outside, the rest of the family following close behind. Jake hesitated for a moment, his gut instinct screaming that something was wrong. It wasn't just the injuries. The air felt heavy, ominous. He stepped onto the porch just as the old man collapsed into his son's arms. The family hurried him inside, laying him on the couch in the dimly lit room. The grandmother lit a candle, her hands shaking as she hovered over her husband, whispering frantic prayers. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. "Papa, what happened?" Carlos's father asked, clutching his father's hand. "Where were you?" The grandfather's eyes fluttered open. His voice was barely a whisper, each word seeming to take immense effort. It came in the night. The dog, gone. I tried to fight, but..." His body convulsed with a violent cough, and blood stained his lips as he gasped for air. The room grew colder as he spoke, and a deep unease spread through Jake. Whatever had happened to the old man wasn't from any ordinary accident. There was something darker at play here. The grandmother worked quickly to clean and bandage his wounds, but it was clear that something was deeply wrong. No matter what she did, the bleeding wouldn't stop. His body was cold, yet his forehead burned with fever. "We need to get him to a hospital," Jake said, urgency rising in his voice. Carlos shook his head. "The nearest hospital is hours away, and we can't drive. My uncle took the car this morning to sell goods and pick up supplies. He won't be back until tomorrow." Jake's stomach nodded. "So we just wait?" Carlos's father, his face drawn and shadowed with worry, nodded grimly. "There's no other choice. The roads are too rough for anything else, and on foot we wouldn't make it in time." As the family continued tending to the old man, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had attacked him wasn't finished. Something dark lingered in the air, creeping closer with every passing minute. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the sound of rustling branches echoed ominously through the stillness of the night. The house had fallen into an uneasy silence. The only sound came from the grandmother's soft murmurs as she tended to her husband, whose fever continued to rise despite her efforts. Jake had retreated to his room, but sleep felt impossible. He lay on the small bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, his mind replaying the disturbing events of the evening. The grandfather's return, his cryptic words about something in the night. It all gnawed at Jake's nerves. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the eerie sounds of the wilderness. Jake tried to dismiss the superstitious stories he had heard earlier, stories of creatures and curses. He reminded himself that he was a foreigner in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by people steeped in local folklore. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. But then he heard it, a faint sound, the unmistakable noise of shattering glass. Jake bolted upright in bed, straining his ears. At first, he thought he had imagined it. Then, the sound came again, a sharp crack, followed by a low, guttural moan that sent a chill down his spine. His heart began to race as he quietly swung his legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the door. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering candle, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. Jake peered down the corridor, but saw no movement. Everyone must still be in their rooms, unaware of the disturbance. Or maybe they were too afraid to leave. Another sound, a thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. Jake's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what to do. It could be the grandfather, delirious and trying to move, or something else. His mind raced through possibilities, each more unnerving than the last. He moved toward the window, drawn by a faint outline in the darkness just outside. Wiping the condensation from the glass, Jake's breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. Jake leaned closer, his hands trembling. When he finally got a clear look, he felt his stomach drop. It was the grandfather. But something was horribly wrong. His stance was rigid, unnatural, and his eyes, Jake could make out a faint red glow, like dying embers flickering from within his skull. The old man's face, twisted in a snarl of pure rage, was barely recognizable. Jake stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, but the bulb flickered weakly and died, plunging the room back into darkness. When he glanced toward the window again, the figure was gone. For what felt like an eternity, Jake stood frozen, his skin crawling with fear. He didn't dare go outside, but he knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't finished. Sleep was no longer an option. Morning light crept weakly into the house, casting long, pale shadows across the floor. Jake hadn't slept a wink after what he had seen, or thought he had seen, the night before. The image of the grandfather standing at the edge of the forest, his eyes glowing with an unnatural red light, haunted him. He tried to convince himself it had been some trick of the mind, exhaustion playing with his senses, but deep down, the fear gnawed at him. When Jake finally left his room, he found the family gathered in the small bedroom where the grandfather had been lying. The tension in the air was palpable, everyone's faces drawn with anxiety. Carlos and his father stood near the bed, while the grandmother sat in a corner, her expression pale and hollow. Jake's stomach sank when he noticed the bed was empty. Carlos's mother spoke first, her voice trembling. His condition got worse last night, much worse. The grandmother nodded, her voice cracking with exhaustion. I stayed up with him as long as I could. I tried to cool his fever, but nothing worked. I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, he was gone. The window. She trailed off, gesturing weakly toward the far side of the room. Jake turned to see the window wide open, shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. A cold breeze drifted in from outside, carrying with it the faint scent of the forest. We found this when we woke up, Carlos's father said quietly. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed with worry. None of us heard him leave. Jake swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it. How could he have just left? He was too weak to even walk, let alone climb out a window. Carlos shook his head. We don't know, but he's gone. Jake's thoughts raced back to the figure he had seen the previous night. The glowing eyes, the rigid stance. He hesitated, then spoke. I think I saw him last night, out by the trees. He looked. He stopped, not sure how to describe what he had seen. Different. Carlos and his father exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fear. Before Jake could elaborate, a piercing scream cut through the air, a sound so sharp and panicked that it froze everyone in place. It was Carlos's mother. Without hesitation, the family rushed toward the source of the scream, with Jake following close behind, his heart pounding in his chest. They found her standing in the doorway of the children's room, her face ashen, hands covering her mouth in horror. Jake's breath caught in his throat when he saw what she was staring at. The young sister was huddled in a corner, sobbing uncontrollably. Blood smeared across the floor in dark streaks, leading to the broken window. The bed where her brother had been sleeping was empty. Carlos's father knelt beside his daughter, his voice shaking as he tried to calm her. What happened? What did you see? Through her tears, the little girl struggled to speak. It was Abuelo, she whimpered. He came in through the window. He took him. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the child's sobs. Carlos's mother collapsed to her knees, trembling as she clutched her daughter. Carlos stood frozen, his face drained of all color, unable to process the enormity of what was happening. Jake felt a deep, cold dread creeping into his bones. The grandfather, who had been too weak to move, who had disappeared just hours before, had taken the boy. The reality of it was too horrifying to fully comprehend. Carlos's father was the first to break the silence. We need to find him. Now. The family quickly mobilized, rushing outside to alert the neighbors. Within the hour, a small search party had formed. They combed the forest near the house, calling the boy's name. But as the hours dragged on, there was no sign of him, or the grandfather. As the sun began to dip once more below the horizon, the search was reluctantly called off. No trace of either had been found. The villagers, visibly shaken, retreated to their homes, bolting their doors and shutting their windows against the encroaching darkness. Back at Carlos's house, the tension was unbearable. Jake sat in the living room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was still coming. He also noticed something troubling. The car, the one Carlos's uncle was supposed to have returned with, hadn't arrived. But with everything that had happened, no one had mentioned it. The unspoken dread of it all weighed heavily on them. The house felt colder than ever as night closed in, wrapping its suffocating grip around everyone inside. The once welcoming home had transformed into a fortress of fear. No one dared speak too loudly, as though even their voices might summon something lurking in the shadows. Carlos's mother hadn't stopped crying since the disappearance of her son. Her sobs, quiet but constant, filled the house with a sense of impending doom. Jake sat near the door, staring blankly out into the darkening sky. His mind raced through the events of the past few days, but no matter how hard he tried, nothing made sense. The grandfather's strange disappearance, the sight of him outside the window, the boy being taken, it all felt too surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Yet, it was happening. Carlos's father paced back and forth across the small living room, his face drawn and grim. The search party had done everything they could, but the forest was vast and unforgiving. There were no tracks, no signs of where the grandfather or the boy had gone. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. Jake leaned forward, lowering his voice to match Carlos's somber tone. "Do you think it's possible that whatever's out there is real? The creature?" Carlos shot him a look, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and fear. "People around here have always talked about it, you know? Some say it's just a story to scare the kids, to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But lately, the attacks on the farms, the missing animals, the people disappearing." He trailed off, as if unsure whether to even acknowledge what he feared might be true. Jake shivered, recalling the way the family had spoken in hushed tones the night before, the way their eyes had darted nervously toward the forest. "Then why didn't anyone leave?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and frustration. "If people are disappearing, why stay?" Carlos sighed heavily, shaking his head. "It's not that simple. Most of the families here have lived in this village for generations. They don't know any other life. It's like they're trapped, not just by the isolation, but by their own fear of what's out there." Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by a loud noise, a crashing sound, like something heavy had slammed into the side of the house. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Carlos's mother gasped, clutching her husband's arm. "It's happening again." Another crash, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. It was coming from the children's room. Without a word, Carlos's father grabbed a flashlight and rushed toward the noise, with Jake right behind him. They reached the room just as the last fragments of glass hit the floor. The window had been smashed inward, shards glittering in the faint moonlight. But this time, nothing was missing. No one had been taken. Instead, smeared across the window frame, was blood, thick and fresh. Jake's stomach twisted in horror. "What the hell is going on?" Carlos's father shone the flashlight out into the darkness beyond the window. For a moment, the beam caught something, just a shadow at the edge of the trees, or maybe a figure standing motionless in the darkness. Jake couldn't be sure, but the sight chilled him to his core. "Did you see that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carlos's father nodded grimly. "It's getting bolder." Jake swallowed hard. The fear that had already taken hold of him tightened its grip even further. Whatever was out there wasn't done with them yet. Night had fully descended, bringing with it a suffocating sense of dread that seemed to choke the air inside the house. No one spoke. No one moved. The broken window in the children's room had been hastily boarded up, but the fear remained thick and oppressive. Carlos sat next to Jake, his eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting something terrible to burst through at any moment. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost too faint to notice, but in the dead silence of the house, everyone heard it. A small, hesitant knock on the front door. Carlos's mother gasped, her face pale. No, it can't be," she whispered, her voice trembling. But there it was again, another knock, louder this time. Then a voice, a child's voice, called from the other side of the door. "Mama?" Carlos's mother froze, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's him. It's my boy," she whispered, rising to her feet, her movements shaky and desperate. "Mama, please open the door." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the words echoed through the room. It was the boy's voice, no doubt about it, but something about it felt wrong. Terribly wrong. He stood quickly, grabbing Carlos's mother's arm before she could reach the door. "Wait," Jake said, his voice thick with unease. "Something's not right." But Carlos's mother was overcome with emotion. She wrenched free from Jake's grip and rushed to the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. She was crying now, breathless with hope. She flung the door open. There, standing in the doorway, was her son. The boy stood motionless, illuminated by the faint moonlight. He looked almost normal, except for the dirt smeared across his face and the dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were torn, but otherwise he seemed unharmed. For a fleeting moment, a wave of relief washed over everyone. The boy was alive. But then Jake saw it. His eyes. Where the boy's once bright eyes had been, there were now dark, empty voids, hollow, lifeless. His face, though expressionless, held something sinister in its stillness. His head tilted slightly, as if he were studying them, waiting. "Mama?" he whispered again, but this time his voice carried a low, guttural growl beneath the words. Before anyone could react, the boy lunged forward, his teeth sinking into his mother's neck. Her scream was sharp but short, choked off as blood poured from the wound. She collapsed to the floor, her body twitching as the boy savaged her neck. Carlos's father shouted, rushing toward her, but before he could reach her, another figure appeared, stepping out from the shadows. The grandfather. He grabbed Carlos's father by the arm and dragged him into the night, the old man's strength far greater than it should have been. Jake stood frozen in horror, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. Carlos's father, the boy, the grandfather, everything was unraveling too fast, like a nightmare spinning out of control. The house was in chaos. The horrifying attack on Carlos's mother had left everyone in a stunned silence, broken only by the distant sound of the wind howling through the trees. Jake stood frozen, staring at the blood pooling on the floor. It had all happened too fast to fully process. Carlos knelt beside his mother, his face a mask of shock and grief. But there was no time to mourn. The air was thick with terror, and they all knew this wasn't over. The boy, whatever he had become, had vanished into the night along with the grandfather. Only Jake, Carlos, the grandmother, and the youngest child were left inside. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a prison, trapping them with the horrors that lurked outside. Carlos stood up suddenly, his hands trembling. He moved toward the door, his mind clearly racing. "I have to go after them," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I can't leave them out there." Jake stepped forward, grabbing Carlos's arm before he could do something reckless. "That's a bad idea, Carlos. Whatever they've turned into, it's not your family anymore. Going out there is suicide." Carlos hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door, torn between his desperate need to act and the overwhelming fear gripping him. After a long moment, he nodded sharply and locked the door, dragging a chair against it in a futile attempt at a barricade. His movements were frantic, his mind barely able to grasp the gravity of what was happening. The grandmother, pale and trembling in the corner, shook her head. "That won't stop them," she said quietly, her voice shaking but resolute. "They can break the windows. They'll come in." Carlos's face fell as the grim reality sank in. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice thick with desperation. The grandmother glanced around the room, her eyes wide with fear, but sharp with thought. "We need to get to the pantry," she said. "There are no windows in there. We can barricade ourselves inside." Jake and Carlos exchanged a quick glance. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than staying out in the open. Jake nodded. "Let's go." The grandmother scooped up the youngest child, holding her close, and the group quickly made their way toward the pantry. They had just reached the door when, without warning, the lights flickered once, then went out completely. The house was plunged into total darkness. The grandmother and the child screamed, their voices lost in the pitch-black void. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he felt something grab him in the dark. Panic surged through him, but before he could shout, a hand yanked him hard. His breath caught in his throat until he realized it was Carlos, pulling him toward the pantry. They stumbled blindly through the darkness, finally slamming the pantry door behind them and locking it. They were safe for the moment. But as they looked around the cramped space, the awful truth became clear. There was nothing inside to barricade the door. "We're trapped," Carlos whispered, his voice trembling. "If they come, we're done." Outside, they could hear the creatures moving through the house, low, guttural noises and the occasional thud of something heavy scraping along the floor. The sound sent a chill down Jake's spine. Time was running out, and they had to act fast. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. "I don't have any signal, but I've got an idea." Carlos furrowed his brow in confusion. "What are you thinking?" "We can use this as a distraction. I'll play music at full volume, throw the phone out, and while they're distracted, we'll make a run for the garage." The bike is still there. Carlos's eyes widened, a flicker of hope returning to his expression. "Let's do it." Quickly, Jake packed 2 small bags with supplies, handing one to Carlos. He opened the pantry door just enough to slip the phone out into the hallway. The soft sound of music filled the silence as Jake tossed the phone toward the other end of the house. "Now," Jake whispered urgently. They bolted from the pantry, hearts pounding as they ran in the opposite direction, toward the garage and the motorcycle. The sound of the music grew faint as they sped through the house, but it was quickly drowned out by a sudden crash behind them. They reached the bike, and Jake climbed on, quickly turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but just as they prepared to take off, a hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed Carlos, yanking him backward. Carlos let out a cry of panic, but in the struggle, the strap of his bag snapped, and he was freed. Jake gunned the throttle, and they sped off into the night, leaving the bag and the nightmare behind them. The motorcycle tore through the darkness, its engine echoing in the emptiness. Neither of them dared look back. The roar of the motorcycle echoed through the night as Jake and Carlos sped down the dirt road, leaving the house and the horrors within it far behind. The cold wind whipped at their faces, but neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they had just witnessed pressed down on them, heavier than the darkness surrounding them. Jake gripped the handlebars tightly, his knuckles white as adrenaline surged through his body. The road ahead was barely visible, illuminated only by the thin beam of the bike's headlight. The forest around them seemed to close in, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands, casting eerie shadows that danced on the edge of his vision. He didn't dare slow down. Carlos clung to Jake from behind, trembling. His arms wrapped tightly around Jake's waist, his face buried against Jake's back, as though shielding himself from the reality of what they had just escaped. The loss of his family weighed on him, every horrifying detail of the night replaying in his mind: his mother's blood, his father dragged into the darkness, his brother's transformation. The grief was overwhelming, but survival was all that mattered now. The road stretched endlessly before them, with no signs of life, no lights, no movement, just the oppressive quiet of the wilderness. After what felt like hours, the sky began to lighten, the faintest glimmer of dawn creeping over the horizon. The cold air bit at their skin, but the sight of the rising sun brought with it a fragile sense of relief. They had survived the night. "There," Carlos whispered suddenly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the engine. He pointed ahead. Jake squinted and saw it too, a small gas station tucked away among the trees, like a forgotten relic from another time. They pulled into the station, the motorcycle sputtering as Jake cut the ignition. Silence followed, deafening in its absence. Both of them sat still for a moment, unmoving, as though the world around them might still be hiding something sinister, something that could leap from the shadows at any moment. Carlos stiffened behind Jake, his gaze locked on something in the corner of the gas station's lot. "Jake," he whispered, his voice shaky. Jake followed Carlos's line of sight and felt his heart skip a beat. Parked near the side of the building was a familiar vehicle, the old, dusty truck, Carlos's uncle's truck, the same one that was supposed to have returned the day before. Carlos's face lit up with a mix of confusion and hope. "It's him," he breathed, his voice lifting with a fragile sense of relief. "It has to be." The gas station seemed abandoned, the windows unbroken and the area oddly well kept. No overgrown weeds, no shattered glass, but no sign of life either. The glass doors of the convenience store were shut, and the lights inside flickered faintly. For the first time in what felt like days, Jake's muscles relaxed slightly. Maybe, just maybe, they were out of danger. "Let's refill the bike and figure out what to do next," he muttered, still on edge. As they approached the store, something caught Jake's eye, a dark stain on the ground near the entrance. He crouched to get a closer look. Blood. Carlos's gasp was sharp and filled with dread. His hand flew to his mouth as he stared at the ground. No,